From Canada, Citizens Forum, where we look at the important issues of the day through a lens of democracy and media and try to figure out, how do we build a better country for ourselves? Hello, welcome to From Canada Citizens Forum. It is Monday, October the 13th, 2025. This is about regarding the Israel-Hamas war. This is another example of how the North American media constantly misinforms us about the most important stories of the day. It is widely believed that of the over 1,200 people killed on October 7th in the Hamas attack, perhaps over half of them were killed by the Israeli military. Israel has a policy called the Hannibal Directive, which states that Israel will not let people be taken hostage. If people are taken hostage, the Israeli military is ordered to attack the hostage takers, even if that puts their own soldiers and citizens who have been taken captive in danger, because they will be caught in the crossfire as the hostage takers are attacked by the Israeli military. This is a fact that is almost never mentioned by our North American media. Here is a brief interview with Professor John Mearsheimer, who is a professor and political scientist from the University of Chicago. Professor Mearsheimer speaks of things that are not part of the official corporate media story. And because he doesn't tell the official story, his views are censored by the corporate media, and we Canadians are not allowed to hear them in our corporate media. That is the state of the free press in Canada and the United States today. In the interview we're going to show, the woman interviewing Professor Mearsheimer is Katie Halper, who is herself Jewish, which clearly shows that not all Jewish people support what Israel has been doing. And I'm not supporting one side or the other in this horrendous war that has killed so many innocent people and soldiers on both sides. I wish this war had never happened. I'm just saying that we Canadians are not being told the truth about the war by our own media. And we've got to stop this kind of censorship, because it is happening more and more and on all of the important issues we face. And if we want to be a democracy in Canada, then we have got to know the truth of what is going on.
So what they did was they rushed in massive firepower, and they used that firepower to attack Hamas and the other Palestinian forces that had moved into Israel proper. And they killed a significant number of people, not with the Hannibal Doctrine, but just with all that firepower that was brought to bear against Hamas and other Palestinians who were intermingled with all sorts of Israelis. Then there's the whole issue of the Hannibal Doctrine, because as we know, the Palestinians were bent on taking many of their captured Israelis back to Gaza. And the Hannibal Doctrine calls for killing those people before they get there. So some Israelis were killed as a result of the Hannibal Doctrine. And then you want to remember, on top of all that, it's consistent with international law for Hamas to try to break out of the concentration camp and to engage Israeli military forces in combat, which means they're going to kill some of them. So the fact that they killed Israeli soldiers is not a case of murder. Now, there were clearly Israeli civilians who were murdered. I'd be willing to bet in the final analysis, however, that Hamas did not murder many of those Israeli civilians. But be that as it may, whoever murdered those civilians, and in my mind committed a war crime. But I think that most of the Israelis who were killed were either soldiers, who I think are legitimate targets, or they were civilians who were killed by the Israeli forces. I think you cannot underestimate how many Israelis were killed when all that firepower was brought to bear. And if you look at a lot of the pictures and you listen to what happened, it's quite clear that those Apache helicopters really wreaked havoc on everything that was down on the ground. And of course, that included Israeli civilians. So I think we have a pretty good sense of what happened. Now, is that reported in the Western media? As Susan was saying before, of course it isn't. The stories that you hear in the Western media, are basically a reflection of Israeli propaganda. I want to make one final point about this. What's also quite stunning about this whole issue is that nobody talks about why there was a breakout. Nobody talks about the fact that this was a concentration camp and what was being done to the Palestinians was abhorrent. And of course, there was going to be a breakout from that concentration camp at some point. The Israelis like to portray this as if it were a bunch of Nazis, as if the Palestinians were the second coming of the Third Reich, and what happened on October 7th is much like what happened in the Holocaust. This is a ridiculous argument. What the Germans did to the Jews is completely different than what the Palestinians did to the Israelis. The Palestinians were the victims. They were in this concentration camp, and you had a breakout on October 7th, hardly surprising. And this is not to excuse the murdering of civilians that took place at the hands of Palestinians. I'm opposed to killing civilians for sure. But again, that I think is just part of the story. You have a much more complicated story at play here. And the more you talk in detail about what happened, the clearer it becomes that Israel bears a great deal of the responsibility for what happened that day.
Here are a few comments from the British newspaper The Guardian about the war. The Guardian says, "Any admiration of Trump stopping the war has to be qualified by a single hard fact. Trump could have done this so much earlier. When he returned to the White House on 20th of January this year, a ceasefire deal not too different from the one we have now was already on the table. When Netanyahu moved to break that ceasefire that existed in March of this year, Trump could have slammed his foot down then and said no to Netanyahu. But instead, he gave Netanyahu a green light. And what followed was, in many ways, the worst 6 months of the war. Trump had the power to stop it months ago, and he chose not to. And right now, we are not being told that in our media. Trump is being hailed as the hero, and it's wonderful that the war has stopped. But the fact that he could have stopped it months ago is not being mentioned. And The Guardian goes on to say, of course, this same critique applies in spades to Netanyahu himself. Indeed, his offense is worse because a deal broadly similar to the one he agreed to this week was on offer as early as June of 2024, more than a year ago. But Netanyahu refused it, and others like it that followed. He decided at each turn that his personal and political interests were best served by an ongoing war.